IVM.
BQ Big Decisions, the BloombergQuint podcast that helps you make the right financial choices. Hello, and thanks for listening in. This is BQ Big Decisions, and I'm Alex Matthew. Over the past few weeks, we've already spoken about a host of interesting topics, from the first steps you need to take to live a better financial life to whether you should buy a house or instead live on rent. To those of you who've written in to tell us what you think, thank you. We appreciate it. Now, when it comes to retirement planning, there's one thing that everyone agrees on, is that the best thing to do is to start early. But the problem arises when we start discussing where to put your money. There's either too much risk or too little return, or it attracts too much tax. In fact, just the other day in office, two of my editors were having quite the heated discussion about the best retirement scheme offered by the government. And I got to thinking, why don't we get them onto this podcast just to set the tone? So here they are. Neeraj Shah is markets editor at BloombergQuint, and Sajith Mangat is the national news editor. Thanks so much for joining us, gentlemen.
Thank you, Alex.
Welcome, Alex.
Well, let's get to the main point here, both of you. And perhaps this is going to set the context for a slightly longer conversation, which we will take forward in just a short bit. But the question here is, which, according to you, is the best retirement product out there? Is it the ones that are provided by the government, or should you look at something else entirely? Or is the option here to go for a combination between the two? Who'd like to start?
Well, if I was looking at it, frankly speaking, a combination of the two is always advisable. But Alex, you will excuse me for being an out-and-out equities person. And if you're talking about starting early and therefore having a long period of time for which your money stays invested, then I would presume even for retirement, equity products are the best products. You could argue that there is safety in debt and therefore look at a lot of host of other debt products, but maybe equity scores over debt. But I don't know if Sajid agrees.
But, there is a risk attached to equity as well. If you're looking at clearly from a perspective of retirement, then you need to look at the product which will give you a retirement benefit when you retire maybe at 60 or 65. I know equities over a period of time always have given a higher return, but they are also a high risk product as well. Now, if you look at a retirement product, it by nature 50% of that is invested in government securities, which gives you a decent amount of return, or maybe I would call it a risk-free return of 7 to 8% per year. But an equity may give you 15% return, but it is a chance that it may take off 50% of your asset as well.
So the schemes that we're talking about, gentlemen, is that there are two of them primarily, the Employee Provident Fund, and there's also the option through the Voluntary Provident Fund to increase your contribution to the Employee Provident Fund, and there's the National Pension Scheme. Now, apart from that, there's also the PPF, which is the Public Provident Fund, which by nature has a very long lock-in period and therefore is considered to be also a retirement product. It can actually be used for long-term goals as well, but a lot of people look at these three options. Now, you're saying, Sajith, that this is something that you should look at primarily when it comes to your retirement savings.
Exactly. The reason being that in India, we don't invest in a retirement product. We invest in a tax product because all of them give you a tax incentive. You need to look from a retirement perspective to invest. And so it has to be conservative in nature because you're talking about after 65. If you look at EPFO or your Employee Provident Fund, there is a component which is deducted for your pension.
Right.
The maximum you get is 15,000 per month at the time of retirement. That's not enough for you to, in today's standard. So you need to have an additional corpus of, annuity income kind of stuff, which gives you every month. So if you go for NPS with the purpose of say, okay, I want monthly income coming in from that product, NPS, falls or fits perfectly into a retirement product. But, there are benefits to equity as well. I'm not denying that.
I get that.
But that's a lump sum thing which you're looking at.
So if I understand correctly, Sajid, the strategy that you are saying that should be employed is to continue, if you are an employee, with your contribution, obviously, which is compulsory to the Employee Provident Fund, and to focus on contribution to the National Pension Scheme for the long term.
The best thing is that you can start with 500 rupees a month for equity SIP. You can also start with 500 rupees a month for a pension.
Exactly. So that's exactly what I want to come to Neeraj on. And if we're talking about starting early, and that's exactly the point that you made right at the start of the conversation, and what a lot of our advisors, even on this podcast, have said, if your goal is more than 5 years away, and if you're starting early, your retirement obviously is going to be more than 5 years away, equity is the best possible option for you, because over a long period of time, it's proven to give you the best possible return. So Sajid's point is that you have a pension or the ability to get a fixed amount of money every month. You can actually work that out in equity as well.
Yeah, so just very quickly, 2 or 3 points. NPS, the annuity income that we're talking about is not tax-free, it's taxable.
Yes.
That's part one. If you're talking about having a non-equity product, NPS is not technically just a pure non-equity product because it invests part into equities as well.
Agreed.
So that is part two. I'm not decrying the importance of NPS as a retirement tool. If you have less than 10 years, then maybe the NPS is a good plan also because it has its merits. Keep in mind, it's over and above the 1,50,000 deduction. So
Correct.
there is an additional 30% tax benefit that comes in if you invest straight up to you.
If you're in the top bracket.
If you're in the top bracket, yeah. But let's work with that assumption. But the limited point that I'm trying to make is, and the only point that I'm making, that from a perspective of this is my personal view. If I have less than 10 years or less than 15 years to retirement, maybe I'll look at NPS because of the tax benefit that comes upfront.
Right.
But over a 20-year cycle, I believe even that limited amount, because if I invest in equity, I don't get tax benefits. So my 50,000 doesn't become 35,000 automatically because 15,000 comes back. But at 35,000 invested in equity over a 20-year period with the return rates of 12% that I believe equities could give over a 20-year period
Will compensate
for the 10% return that NPS gives, even with the tax benefit, because NPS, I presume the returns will be 10%, equities 12%, debt 8%, a summation average of 10% that will overtake over a 20-year period. That's my limited view.
Yeah, but I'm not even here arguing on the issue of returns here. I'm arguing on the fact that there has to be a constant flow of income when you retire from your services.
Absolutely.
Now, if you are looking at your risk profile, your personal finance analyst, or maybe for that matter a consultant would say that okay, you subtract your age from 100 and that would be the kind of equity contribution that your portfolio should have. Now that goes on declining as you go towards your retirement. Now in an equity thing, it may not be a thing because you are going to constantly have a higher component of equity, and so the higher risk also continues as you go towards your retirement. But be that may, returns for sure equity will give you.
Sure.
But that's an investment which you're trying to do, right? You're trying to bring in pension here and not an investment.
Thanks, gentlemen. Fantastic points raised by both of you. And I think that sets the stage perfectly for the rest of this conversation. We've broadly discussed the retirement schemes offered by the government, but now let's get into the granular details. And for that, I'm joined by Amol Joshi, the founder of PlanRupee Investments. Thanks so much for joining us, Amol.
Alex, pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me over.
So why don't we start with the basics? We've already run through the broad tenets, but let's get into this one by one.
Sure.
The available schemes and their individual traits. Let's start with the most commonly used one, and that's because it's compulsory for all salaried individuals, the Employees Provident Fund. The big advantage here is that your contributions to the EPF are deductible from your taxable income, right?
Yes.
But what are the key things to bear in mind when you're talking about the EPF?
As you rightly said, EPF is a compulsory deduction. It is to the extent of 12% of your basic salary, number one. Number two, it is deductible up to 1.5 lakh rupees per annum under Section 80C. Sure. It is at par with that. Another very, very important point in EPF is that it enjoys EEE status. So you have exemption, tax exemption during contribution, accumulation, as well as withdrawal stage.
Okay.
So these are some of the very quick points on EPF.
Okay. And that, of course, is matched by your employer, that 12%. But what else do you have to bear in mind with regard to the interest that you earn and all of that?
Right. So as you made a point in beginning, EPF is sort of a government guaranteed product. It is one of the decent products in terms of interest. So today in 2019, when we are talking, your fixed deposit rates are between 6.5 to 7 or something like that. But on the other hand, your EPF rate of interest is 8.55%. That is significantly higher. And let's not forget that this is exempt at all stages. So this scores significantly better than any of the fixed deposit instruments. This is the specific point that you should remember about what is the sort of interest rate that you get on your EPF contribution.
But how do they manage this, Amol? Because and therefore, how do you understand the risk involved, right? Because this is a guaranteed return.
That is
what are the products that the manager of this fund invests in?
Okay, so earlier it was EPF purely used to, or EPFO, who manages pension funds, purely used to invest into government sort of products. That is GSECs, 10, 20, 30-year government security. These were the products in which EPF used to invest. Over last few years, EPFO has received a permission to invest into equity as well. So in some portion of your EPF money goes into equity via index fund route. So that is the reason how a slightly larger return gets generated in EPF.
Okay, so we've broadly covered EPF. Now, I think it's a good time to talk about the Voluntary Provident Fund, which, as I understand it, allows you to increase voluntarily the amount that you contribute to the EPF.
Yes.
But is there a limit to how much you can increase this contribution?
Yes, Alex. So as the name says, VPF simply stands for Voluntary Provident Fund. The limit for a VPF contribution per month is 100% of your basic. In the sense, you cannot exceed the amount of investment in VPF which exceeds 100% of your basic component. So that's the limit what we are talking about in VPF.
Okay, and it's the same scheme, right? So
it's the same scheme. It's only the only difference is it is voluntary. You as an employee are choosing to invest more than what is required. Probably because you are very, very serious about accumulating a kitty or corpus for your retirement, or probably you're a very intelligent person who wants to get advantage of 8.55% tax-free return.
Guaranteed tax-free return.
That is correct.
Let's talk about this extremely intelligent individual, and let's talk about what happens when you withdraw the EPF. At what point can you do that?
Right. So EPF, ideally, it's a provident fund scheme. Ideally, you should let it run the entire course till your retirement. But as you mentioned, in a hypothetical scenario that you have to withdraw it, if you withdraw it before 5 years, then it will be taxable in your hands. Number one, your tax benefit, it's simply not there. Number two, after completion of 5 years, if you are starting on your own, or if you quit, or if you are migrating, then let me take an example of you want to start on your own. You are starting your own business. You have to have a gap of 2 months after which you can redeem your entire corpus that you have accumulated over the years.
I read somewhere it's 75% after the first month and then the rest.
Yes, and 100% withdrawal only after 2 months of unemployed period.
Okay, and after 5 years, if you held on for more than 5 years,
then it will be tax. Yes, the tax benefit remains intact.
Okay, so that's more or less what you need to know about the EPF and the VPF. That's the Voluntary Provident Fund. Let's now talk about the National Pension Scheme, Amol. It was launched in 2004, but most people know about it now because of the added incentive that was provided just a few budgets back.
Yes.
And that's the 50,000 rupee additional deduction.
Over and above ATC 1.5 lakhs. Correct.
Right. So let's talk about the broad tenets.
Sure. So NPS is a national pension scheme which can invest in 3 asset classes: government securities, corporate bonds, or equity. You can choose various proportions. We will touch upon that in our conversation. However, this additional 50,000 rupees really gave an impetus to people's attention towards NPS. NPS, now let me make it very, very clear over here. It is a government approved or government launched scheme, but it is not a government guaranteed scheme. So your returns will vary. In PPF or in VPF or even in EPF, your return is known, right? We discussed 8.55 few minutes back. Right. However, in NPS, the returns are purely market driven. So instead of 8.55, it could be 7.55, or for all you know, it could be 10.55 as well. These are just examples.
And there's also the difference with regard to who manages the NPS.
That is correct. So previous products, what we discussed, all of those are purely managed by government or government entities. NPS is managed by professional fund managers. So you have a public sector entity like SBI and LIC and UTI, SBI and LIC managing it. You also have private sector entities like Reliance, ICICI, Kotak managing it. And while opting for an NPS, you can choose the fund manager that you desire to opt for.
Fantastic. Now, you also mentioned the contribution within the NPS and choosing which asset bucket or class class you wanted to go towards. What is how do I fix that?
Actually, earlier when NPS started, equity component was restricted at 50% only. But after the market feedback, because see, essentially this is a pension product and pension horizon could be 10, 20, 30 years or more. Within such a long period of time, if you do not have equity in a larger proportion, you are probably compromising on the return that your money can generate.
Right.
Now you have two sort of additional product choices that are provided. First one is the life choice product, in which you can your equity starts with 75 in an aggressive plan, and every year it drops by a certain percentage, so that at the age of 55 you do not have a large equity component. It will come down to, let's say, 25%.
Okay.
You also have something called as active choice, in which you can have a 75% equity component up to age 50. But however, from 50 to 55, it again drops down to below 50%. So these are various. Here we have mainly covered the equity component,
right,
because the rest of the components are purely steady return generating assets like government securities or corporate bonds.
And that, of course, would depend on the risk profile. Dear listener, we're going to have a conversation in just a short while. I just want to point this out on risk profile, the importance and how to identify where you sit on the risk scale. But that's for another date. For now, let's turn to the next conversation, which is the withdrawal for the NPS. That, of course, is there was a change in the budget 2019 with regard to the taxable nature of it, right?
Yes, correct. So in this budget, your NPS withdrawal at age 60 onwards has become 60% of lump sum you can withdraw during your retirement phase, and it will be completely tax-free. Remaining 40% does not come to you. Rather, you mandatorily have to buy an annuity product.
Right.
Annuity product, as you know, it's simply you invest lump sum, and depending on what annuity rate is available. I'm only for an example, I'm taking 6% as annuity rate. Example, if you invest 100 rupees in annuity at 6%, roughly 0.5% per month you will get as your annuity.
Right.
Also, very important to remember, annuity is taxable in your hands just like salary or just like pension income that you will draw.
Fantastic. So, and okay. So we've clearly established the withdrawal, how that works and the taxable nature of it. Let's move on and talk about the last scheme, which is the Public Provident Fund.
Sure.
Now, Amol, I've actually heard from a few people that this shouldn't be considered a retirement product because of the 15-year lock-in period. But is that the right way to approach it?
See, Alex, I have a different take over here. PPF, as you know, is a product of choice for Indian investors.
Right.
Most of the times, even when child is born, immediately afterwards, most of the times, the PPF account gets opened. If you have somehow missed that bus and you started earning, I'm sure that your parents, your well-wishers are going to ask you to open PPF account much sooner than you think.
Yeah.
Number one. Number two, the 15-year lock-in period, what we just now spoke of, that 15-year can be extended with a 5-year block of time at every maturity stage.
Sure.
So it can be longer than 15 years as well. Number two. And number three, see, the word provident itself has a connotation or has a relationship with your retirement.
Right.
So I would very positively, strongly say that PPF also can be a good retirement product offering to invest into.
Before we get into the advice that you have for our listeners, I do want to close the loop on the PPF. What are the rules with regard to withdrawals, and there are certain other benefits with regard to taking a loan and etc., right?
Right. So PPF, always remember very, very clearly, PPF also falls under ATC. 1.5 lakh rupees is annual maximum contribution that you can make. Minor also can open an account, but the limit of 1.5 lakh will be shared between minor and parent. Number two. Number three, the product can run for 15 years with renewal of 5-year renewal blocks possible.
Sure.
Number four, you spoke about withdrawals. So again, the advice that I gave a few minutes back, it is in your best interest to have this product run the longest course, simply because it also gives you a triple E taxation, exempt during contribution, accumulation as well as withdrawal stage. Current rate of interest is about 7.9%. This is again much higher than any of the fixed income or fixed deposit products that you get. If you withdraw, if you're talking about withdrawal from PPF, it is allowed only after 7 years completion in your PPF. Once your PPF attains 7 years of age, only then you can withdraw a certain component, 50% of your component of your previous balance. So these are some of of the points
and
that
then
you should remember.
Every subsequent year you can withdraw.
Yes, after
50%.
once 7 years are completed, then you do have a choice to dip into that. Generally, again, remember, there are 4 or 5 occasions for which the withdrawals are permitted. If you have a medical emergency, medical expense, if you have a higher education or marriage related expense coming up, or if you are constructing your first house or buying first house, these are some of the important life milestones during which the withdrawals are permitted.
Right. So we've spoken about the basic tenets in quite a lot of detail, Amol, but now comes the difficult part.
Yeah.
How do you choose which is the best retirement option within the schemes available? Or, in fact, if you want to go the equity route or the mutual fund route, should you do that?
Right. Alex, as you mentioned, which is the best option? Now, best option differs from person to person simply because your risk profile may be different than mine. So if you are an equity bull, if you believe in India growth story, then other than EPF, which is your mandatory deduction, you can't do much about it.
Right.
You would probably opt for NPS, where you have a 50 to 75% of equity allocation possibility.
Right.
If you are a totally risk-averse investor, and after EPF mandatory deduction, if you still have some window left in 1.5 lakh rupees, you will probably go for PPF.
Right.
Which is
That's
separate,
a public provident
public provident fund. Now, I also like the next point what you mentioned, something like direct equity or mutual funds.
Sure.
If you are out and out equity person, you are going to think that I have 10, 20, 30 years to go for my retirement, and equity is significantly likely to outperform all these instruments provided I invest 100% in it. If you are somebody who subscribes to this school of thought, then I would simply say you can opt for any of the retirement products offered by mutual funds where 100% equity allocation is possible. Within that, these retirement mutual funds also offer you same tax benefit of Section 80C.
Sure.
Or you can simply invest into ELSS, Equity Linked Savings Scheme, which is a 100% equity scheme, and hold it for your retirement horizon, till your retirement horizon.
All right. That more or less covers all of the aspects of this conversation with regard to your retirement planning. Of course, these investments are specific to that retirement goal. And if you have additional goals apart from that, depending on the tenor of those goals or when you want to achieve them, you can choose different options.
Sure. That's correct.
Thanks so much, Amol, for joining us and giving us your advice and, in fact, giving us all that information about the schemes and what essentially they entail. Dear listener, thank you so much for joining us on this conversation. I hope that it helped you make the choice that you have to make with regard to your own retirement. This is Alex Matthews signing off. Have a great day and happy saving.
If you enjoyed Big Decisions, check out some other podcasts on the IVM Podcast Network. You can check out Paisa Vaisa, hosted by Anupam Gupta, Advertising is Dead, hosted by Varun Dugirala, the Ronnie Screwwala podcast, hosted by Ronnie Screwwala, or Cyrus Says, hosted by Cyrus Procha. These shows are available on the IVM Podcast website, app, or wherever you get your podcasts from.
Advertising is dead. Yep, you heard me right. Advertising is dead. We're all in the content business now. Let's not call it news, TV, radio, etc., etc. It's all content, and we're in the middle of this weirdly exciting phase where all the borders and lines that have been drawn over decades has been swept away by this lovely thing called the internet. We're a show where we don't dwell on just the stuff that is now, but rather the wider stuff about advertising, media, content, and the whole goddamn circus surrounding it. Tune in every Tuesday for our weekly unboxing of the mystery box we used to call advertising. I'm Varun Dugirala, co-founder and content chief at The Glitch, and this is my new podcast, Advertising is Dead.
Are you constantly seeking happiness? Wondering how to make the most of every day? How not to let your inhibitions stop you from achieving your goals? It's now time to get your A-game on. It's time to unlock your true potential. Tune in to the Empowering series with me, Zarina Poonawalla, to feel empowered in all genres of life. From behavioral skills to management skills. From health to relationships. From mental well-being to emotional well-being. And of course, your finances. I've got you covered. With these tips and tricks from me, Zarina, and true life stories from my amazing guests, you're bound to bring your purest to the table. Tune in to the Empowering series with Zarina Poonawalla every Thursday on the IVM Podcast app, website, or wherever you listen to podcasts.